In this episode of the Exploring Information Security podcast, what is rapid threat modeling?
Computers now have primary control of critical functions.
Houston, recommend vector transfer.
Your go for APU shutdown on time.
Roger, go for deploy.
Nice to be in orbit.
Welcome to the Exploring Information Security podcast, where you learn, explore, and grow your security mindset. I'm your host, Timothy DeBluck, and in this episode, we will be exploring rapid threat modeling. With me to do that is Geoff Hill, the founder and director of Tutamanic Security. Show notes can be found at exploresec.com/EIS. You can support the podcast by donating. You can also sign up for the newsletter. I got that thing sort of started. Feedback for the show can be found at timothy.dblock@exploresec.com. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn. You can also rate the podcast on your favorite podcast platform. That really helps get the podcast spread out a little bit more and into the algorithms that these podcast platforms like to use. So really appreciate anyone doing that. So this was a good episode, great conversation with Geoff. Who has answered the question that I get a lot when I do my threat modeling talk of like, how do you scale threat modeling? And I think he's got some really great ideas about this. And I mean, there's not really much else to say other than it's a great way to kind of get some quick threat modeling in place and get it kind of on an iterative basis. So it's kind of following that development life cycle. But, with that, let's get right into it.
Yeah, Tutamanic is, so I started the company back in 2015, and I saw a problem with the way that people did threat modeling. And everyone got out there, and we all did it the same way. We all got a bunch of people in the room, and generally, I always joke it had no windows, and no one got any water, and no one was allowed to leave, and you all just like argued on a whiteboard until you came up with something that didn't represent anything you wanted because you got a bunch of white elephants. You said like, "Hey, well, what if a bunch of ninjas jump out of the roof and take over the building?" Like, it's not gonna happen. There are things that are gonna happen and not gonna happen. Like, we can't base a threat model upon a bunch of black swans, and that's kind of what we saw happening. And then people got frustrated with it, and they said, "Well, it doesn't represent reality." And of course, it doesn't. You didn't put reality into it. Right. And then they kind of said, "Well, threat modeling sucks," which is the final bit to it. We'll put it on John. And they point at some poor guy over in the corner, and they'd say, "You're going to do all the threat modeling." And this guy would be like, "What, me?" And, and then next thing you know, this person is doing threat modeling for a dozen different projects, not knowing any of them and not doing it well, because eventually this person burns out. Like, that's not really a sustainable model. And so I groused about it, and I said, well, okay, I can do this better, can I? I mean, we're already building the designs, aren't we? Why don't we just kind of layer the threat model on top of the designs? That was my original kernel of idea. Mm-hmm. And so it built from there. It's like, okay, then we can take any design that anybody has in any functional design, and we'll convert it to a threat model. That's the first part, by adding a little bit to it. And then the second part was, well, people started griping about the fact that, hey, it's all fine and good, but we don't know what threat modeling means. Okay, well, what if I put training out there? Okay, well, I've got training now. And so we've got the people part. So we've got the tech and the people part, and then the process part, which goes in between, which is usually the non-sexy part. We all agree upon it, is where we say, okay, we're going to go out there and we're going to provide consulting. Hey, how do you go about putting this into your CI/CD and all that right there? How do you go about putting this into your into your workflow? And like, what I originally did is I said, you know what? Screw this. I'm going to make an open source. Well, I didn't say open source, but I'm going to make a pattern. And that pattern became a process. And I said, I'm going to release it on GitHub. I'm tired of this. I'm tired of this crap. I'm going to put it onto GitHub. And then it's sitting on GitHub right now. And then I did a number of talks on it. And it's like 2017 to 2019, where I said, okay, I'm going to do a number of talks on it. And this is what I see as a way of speeding up the process. And that's the rapid threat model prototyping that you were looking at. And the idea behind it is that get rid of all the cruft, get it so it works with the team, not with just one person. And if a team does it, it's quicker. If a team does it, everyone's got a stake in it. If a team does it, they'll embed it into the process. And let me show you guys how to do it in the process. And let me show you how to use all the open source stuff you have out there and pull it together so you can actually get all those open source frameworks to talk to each other. Let's map them. And then once we do that, then we have a fantastic foundation to actually move forward and actually have a functional team create the threat model. That's the entire idea. So the whole stride thing, great way to teach people, but let's base it upon things that the functional team understands. And then once they do that, then they can actually move forward. Because let's put it this way. The functional team wants to have a good product, don't they? Ultimately. I mean, any of us do. I was working as a developer for a long time, and I wanted to put out a good product. I felt proud about it. But part of the whole thing is, like, people don't understand that security is part of that. They shouldn't realize that it's a separate thing. It's not. And so therefore, let's give them the tools, such as threat modeling, to talk about it when they're making the product, such as the story building. They can all put it together.
Yeah, that's one of the things I tell people benefit is really just getting people on the same page. To your point, right? It's not even there's a business benefit to it, not just always security too. It's just really thinking about what can go wrong with this. It's a
what-if analysis, isn't it?
Yeah.
You and I do it. We do it every day, being parents, right?
Yes.
What if my child goes jumping off this? Like, whoa, maybe I shouldn't do that. Maybe I should pull this across. Like, we do threat modeling, I guess, in a sense, every day by pulling chairs away, or by doing these things, or by thinking 2 steps ahead. And I continuously think about, geez, I think my son's going to try to jump on that. You know what? I think I'll pull that away, or I'll say no to him, or I'll talk to him beforehand, and I'll prevent it before it happens. I mean, I could allow it, and then what would happen? Like, I've got a screaming son who's got a bloody lip. Like, okay, I don't really want that, do I?
Right.
So I try to cut it off.
Right. So with this approach that you've come up with, the threat modeling, is it prototyping?
Yeah. So it takes the idea of prototyping and says, look, we're going to put together, and we're going to apply the idea of rapid prototyping to threat modeling. So we're not going to expect a perfect threat model. Too many companies have said, we want you to come out with 100% threat model right now, and you end up doing a threat model, and then all of a sudden, like, the project's finished, or you've already gone to release, and like, I kind of missed that one. So the idea is that you get together with a team and you say, you know what, look, guys, we're going to cover as many bases as we can. When the time comes up, we move forward. And then we go back, we know what we have in the backlog, we go back and we address those issues with any kind of extra time we have, like team points or anything like that we have. And we keep doing that. And as we do that, revolving through, each revolution is getting tighter and tighter, isn't it? Until you get the really hard problems. Potentially, you've already bracketed them with a lot of the easier stuff. So you either if you have the hard problem, you say, okay, look, we know what it is, and we're going to go back and readdress the root problem. We know what it is, and we might have to change everything. It's a hell of a lot easier to change the design than it is to change the build. Yeah, you've already built it. That's not very easy to change. It's already got dependencies. You're in a design stage, and you're revolving through it, and you're using open source platforms to say, okay, look, I don't want to try to think of the solution. I'm going to grab the solution from these open source patterns that already exist. That's the big thing.
So when you say rapid prototyping, are you like, is that what is that? That's a concept within development, or like?
Yeah, rapid prototyping. It's like, we're going to go out there. Like, you remember they had the whole thing of MVP, most valuable, product, right? That kind of thing. Well, imagine, like, you got your rapid prototyping. It's like, okay, look, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to move up to the MVP by, I'll produce a product 0.01. People say it's crap. Okay, I get the information back. I change it 0.02. It's improved. I've hit the MVP. But the MVP is not good enough. I'm going to get some more information back. I'm going to keep on improving upon it. It's iterative. And being iterative, it therefore works within any kind of workflow we have, like, an Agile workflow.
Yeah, I hadn't even thought about that, but you're absolutely right. Right, threat modeling to me can seem very waterfallish versus a lot of things are doing DevOps and Agile nowadays, right?
Sorry, exactly. I mean, why the expletive deleted? Are you doing this way?
Yeah.
Because all you're doing is turning people off. Sorry, I'm ranting.
No, you're good.
I rant a lot, but I say, like, why are you doing it this way? You're just turning people off to the subject, and you're just adding to the fuel to the fire that people say, like, whoa, security. God, that really sucks. Yeah, it's like pulling hen's teeth. I get it, but it doesn't have to be that way. It really doesn't have to be. It can be as simple as a discussion at the beginning of like you're sitting down, let's say you and I are in a sprint, okay? And the team gets together and we're discussing what we're going to build in that sprint. And we've got the user story there. And we go through the methodology, which says, okay, look, we're going to break that story down. And we're going to find all the security issues with it. And we're like, okay, this doesn't apply, this applies. And it takes maybe 10 minutes, maybe at most, okay? We've added to our overload. But at that point in time, we've taken care of all the security. And then when we move forward, we don't have some person coming after us and going like, hey, man, you've got to change all this stuff because you didn't put in, for example, TLS. We're like, TLS, what the hell is that shit? And next thing you know, you've got to rip it all apart because you got dependencies, you merge it into the system, and God forbid that's gone down and that's been, that's been engineered. So what you're doing is you're cutting it off at the very beginning. And you're getting it so it's at the inception point.
Yeah, no, I like that because I mean, one of the benefits, but it sounds like you have to have a person almost sitting in those stand-ups where they're discussing the stories, which I was fortunate enough to be at an organization where I was the absolute person that did that. Now I still did threat modeling sessions, but to your point, I think this is also kind of a big thing within the threat modeling industry is that people want to be so detailed with it. And I never was like down in the weeds with it, trying to find everything. I was like, did we have a good discussion on this? Did we get through what we felt like were our entire list of what we thought might occur based on what we know, and then move on. Right. But I like that. And I was kind of already doing that within sitting in the stand-ups when they had to adjust something. I was already there going, oh, wait, we might not want to do that. Right?
You're the guy in the background going like, guys, you might want to think about this.
Yeah.
Or like Han Solo. It's like, what's it? That might not be a good idea kind of thing, right?
I have a bad feeling about this.
I've got a bad feeling about this. And you're like a Han Solo sitting. I got a bad feeling about this. And it's kind of like that because so one of the things that I do espouse as part of the process, the RTMP process is, look, everyone should already have this, but we espouse it is get a person in the team who's gung-ho or who really wants security to be in, okay? A security champion. So imagine this, if you get a dozen different teams out there and their development teams, and you have a security champion in each one, now the security group, which is maybe a dozen people at most, doesn't have to focus so much on micromanaging, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
The security team takes care of all the low-hanging fruit. Now you can deal with the bigger stuff. Every now and then you touch base with them. It makes it de-stresses that. It decouples things. Now you can take that same pattern, and we've done this in a credit card, or not a credit, well, in the credit card company I worked with, and also in a greeting card company. Funny enough, I work for both. But you can do you can apply that in the same way to their HR departments, to their finance departments. Because guess what we don't do? We usually gloss over that. And guess who buys off-the-shelf software that they don't usually configure correctly?
Right. HR.
And next thing you know, you're called in and HR says, like, I have no idea. But somehow all of our, applicants, their names got out. Like, gee, I wonder why. Oh, you're using this, and this, and you fired somebody and you still left them in the system and they have admin rights, blah, blah, like that. So, so that's an extreme part. But at least if you have the security champion sitting on each team, they can kind of say, like, they're the Han Solo. I got a bad feeling about this, and they can back everyone off the ledge. Once you have that situation, then the RTMP becomes a lot easier because they engage a conversation. They shut off the conversation. They say, look, I hate to say it, but we're done with the threat modeling conversation because I'm a functional person first, and I'm a security person afterwards. let's move on. The person's got enough information, they move on, right? The team's got enough information. What we're not looking for is we're not looking for perfection. You're never going to get it. Or if you do get it, the horse has already left. It's already run away. And I say, then what's the point of doing threat modeling? If you're, and where else do we ask for perfection?
Mm-hmm.
So I had the other day, I had someone say to me, well, we want threat modeling where we don't get many data points back. And I said, okay, you realize you're going to miss a lot of the information the threat model is going to provide. Oh, yeah. So what if I give you all the information and I let you take care of, filtering it? And they said, yeah. Okay, then we're going to miss all the information. I'm like, well, didn't you just say that you didn't want all the information? That kind of thing. So, right. I don't think, so what we need to do as practitioners is we need to say, look, we're going to give you as much information as you possibly want within your certain structures, but what you're going to ask for, and then on the next iteration, you can ask for more information. And with new inputs that come in, you're going to get higher fidelity information, and you're going to be using open source tools and open source frameworks to help you understand that information, because you're not security people. But if I give you, let's say if I give you OWASP Top 10, well, I think any engineer can read OWASP Top 10 and get an idea of what it means. And they also don't have to think like, oh, hang on, what are the security controls here? Oh, here it is. It's just a list. I'll start there. And that stops the analysis paralysis, which is another kind of end part.
Yeah. No, I've never had that threat modeling, but I can see where people have it, because threat modeling can get very deep. But like, I like that too with the OWASP, right? Because especially if you have different things. So an API OWASP and threat model is much different than your web application, where you're dealing with cross-site scripting. But if it's an API, right, it's more you have to think about authentication, authorization, which a lot of tooling,
isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you that just having that understanding gives people the nuance of like thinking about the different things that, and again, going back to it, could go wrong with the application.
And you're giving the power to the team, because I think what too many security people do and what too many managers do is they say, you know what, you're functional guys, you're idiots though when it comes to security, so we're going to treat you like children. And then security, and then the functional people are like, well, yeah, we're children. And what do children do? They cause chaos. You and I know that.
Yeah.
Okay, look, treat them like adults, please. You pay them well enough. Treat them like adults, and they'll be adults. Tell them that they create good code. Tell them they create good systems, and they'll be that way.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing too, it's like it's a whole program in itself, because threat modeling to me is just one piece of that, and that's and that's why my developers are so engaged too, and they kind of became their own, and I hate the term security champions, because if you talk to a developer and ask them, what do you think is security champion? They're like, it's very corporate. So essentially I'm giving them a hall monitor set. But either way, I just think they're good developers, right? They started taking into security consideration, one, because we started talking about it, but two, they knew I was going to catch it later on. I have totally owned their website. One of my favorite stories is I turned one of their profile pages into like Tim's Hacker YouTube playlist. And I was loading YouTube videos onto which it was in a field that it shouldn't have been. But essentially, once you build that relationship, they know, like, if they don't think about it, Tim will find it at some point, right? Tim's going to test it at the end of the day, whether it's automated tooling via your SaaS DAST or a manual test,
a workstation or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
We had that too. Like, I'll tell you a story that in Visa. With a fellow architect, security architect, he left his machine unlocked, and I warned him. I said, I'm sitting right next to you, like, don't leave your machine unlocked, because I will fool around with it. Mm-hmm. And I did the stupidest thing. I did a Unix command which caused it basically to reverse itself.
That's always the worst.
And it's like, oh, what the hell, that kind of thing. There's another time I did another foolish thing where to some guy's code base, I added a Unicode character which looks like a semicolon. I forget the number of it.
Oh no!
And so every time we tried to compile it, it said syntax error, and he's going nuts. He's like, it's not a syntax. Like, all he saw was a semicolon. I said, well, finally, I was in tears next to him, and I said, okay, look, don't leave your machine unlocked.
Mm-hmm.
And granted, that's a stupid low level thing, but it shows, in a way, it shows one of the ingress points, doesn't it? It says, and I totally agree with you. Like, okay, if you remove security champions, say that you're more Neo, like you've like, I know security, that kind of thing, or whatever, I know Kung Fu, but right. It's a fact, like everyone should right now. Obviously, you and I agree upon that. But in addition to that, I think that they actually do want to know that. I know
mm-hmm.
very few. I know very few developers or engineers or integration people who say like, I don't care about security. I think almost all of them to a T say like, I'd like to know more. And if you give them that information, they're going to use it properly because, again, they're not stupid people. So.
Yeah, well, that's why I think threat modeling too really helps out, because it helps them potentially even talk about bugs that might pop up. It's not necessarily a security issue. It might be and so now they're thinking about quality versus, and that's something they know how to think about as well. Most of them know how to think about is quality, because if they're following the development framework and the documentation for the framework and doing things properly, that's going to help it write better code, which better code is just going to be more secure inherently.
And how many times have you been in a stand-up or something like that where someone says something and you do like this? And like, well, I've never thought of that. Mm-hmm. Because mm-hmm. continuously I'm being challenged on it, and I'm being, and people are saying this kind of thing, and I'm saying, actually, I've never thought of it that way, or I've never thought of that. That's a pretty good idea.
Yep.
And goes into the threat model, shall we say, setup. And because basically what we're saying is, look, in order to speed these things up, use the open source frameworks to describe yourself, bring it all back to Stride. If you tie everything back to Stride, because Stride's pretty easy to understand, and it's got 6 basic things to describe. And once you describe that to people, and once you get that and you give that knowledge out, and you can put other networks and parallel other networks into it, then you say, look, every part of a design is going to have a certain aspect to it. And then you can understand that that certain parts of the design are not going to have identity issues. They're not. So a component that's deep inside of the design is going to have a very low percentage chance of identity issues. But in most cases, a lot of your identity issues are going to happen closer to any boundary. So mm-hmm. RTMP takes that into account. It's going to say that elevation of privilege issues exist across the entire application or entire system or entire infrastructure. Why? Because we make mistakes as human beings. We make assumptions. We say, yeah, sure, no problem. We'll connect this piece to this piece. And that's we know that piece hasn't been, integrated in. No problem. And they do it all the time. And next thing you know, big world of problem comes because something comes in that's not authorized, and then jumps into a section which assumes that lower authorization piece has been authorized, and then the world of hurt comes out. So once you get them to understanding that, and you show them a simple way, part of RTMP is like showing a simple way of recording that by saying, look, there are places which are higher privilege and lower privilege. And if a functional person is going to deal with that, you're going to talk about what we talk about is the levels of privilege in terms of numbers. And we say, look, if it's outside of your privilege, it's outside of your power in the system you're talking about, you give it a 0. And that 0 means mathematically it's nothing. Okay. And this worked because, and you go up on average to 9. I have worked it beyond 9, but for working purposes, you say 9 is something where data hits a disk, where the data ends up somewhere on a store, in a disk or something like that, on cache. And that's generally where the bad guy is going to go. So that's usually the high quality territory where they're going to attack. And that's where you're going to focus on initially. And then you look at all the chains that work their way up there, the data flows that work their way up there. And like, how do you work that way up there? And like, look, how many different levels do you go up from there? And from that, you see gaps. And when you see the gaps, when you start working it that way, you say, okay, look, I see a jump. I see where a potential administrator logs into a section that's a 1. It's a 1 is defined as a shim. And once they do that, they jump right into a database. And I'd say, well, okay, isn't that a problem? Because potentially you're jumping from a 1 to a 9. not saying things get more complicated, but what it does, it shows the people the numbers, and it says a 1 to a 9 is a mathematical +8. You're doing a jump, a massive jump between there. You should start focusing on why that's a problem, because you're not having any kind of protections in between that. So, okay, so then you go to another one and you say, okay, look, another flow goes from an outside person logging into a website. I'm just anonymous and I'm a 0. So then I go in, I log in, and then once I get my context, I start moving through other different processes until I get to that database. At each point, I can actually, the defender, us, can put in protections or defense in depth to potentially challenge or stop that person along the way. And then it makes you think, like, okay, we got to put defense in depth in. We have to not just assume that the data coming to us is benign, it's potentially malicious. And that's what you do with doing the threat modeling, right? You're challenging each thing. And you're saying, well, do we actually agree that this is a benign data flow coming in? Okay, that's a standard threat modeling thing. But then what my process says is we have the stages, we've numerically ranked the stages, therefore potentially we can put those in and we can start looking at them in a database or in a CSV file or something like that. We can start, like, what do I want to say, munging them. Which like if you take a look at most threat models out there, it's mostly paragraphs of things, paragraphs of stuff. Like, okay, how can I go about taking that information and actually using it in a, how can I actually, I can read it, but it's going to take my time to read it. Yeah, I could put AI to it, but they'll mangle it and they'll tell me to put glue on pizza and stuff like that. So I can't challenge AI. So how can I go about taking that free form information and use it? Well, I can't. But if we use my methodology says, look, we're going to start by actually using numerical ranks so that it makes it easier for the next team to come along and to automatically understand that a 9 means a data sync, that a 0 means outside of our control. And now, next thing you know, you've made all of your different models fairly uniform across the company. They haven't changed it drastically. You said, okay, look, we're going to put a numerical ranking on these. And then once we've done that, then we can start applying some simple rules to it, which all RTMP does. It says, look, if it goes positively from link to link, then we apply certain rules. If it goes negatively, we apply certain other rules. If it goes from outside to inside, we apply certain rules, such as, such as spoofing is one, is outside to inside. And then another one would be denial of service. Because most denial of service will happen usually where you don't have control. When you have control, it's much more difficult for an attacker to get denial of service against you, especially deep inside of whatever system you have. So once you've isolated that and you stated, okay, these things can be done fairly pro forma, then you can get to the real job, which is let's work on the controls.
So are these like zones? Are these like your different, or you said stages too? Like how do or is it just something that the group kind of defines and comes up with, and then you can apply it to whatever threat model?
So the idea behind it is that every threat model is unique in the sense that the zones of control that exist inside of that threat model are not strictly compatible with zones of control inside of another threat model in the company. However, there are usually a few absolutes. 0 always means outside of that control of that particular model. So if we're talking about an internal model that only talks to internal components, 0 means other internal components that you don't control. If we're talking about a website, 0 means any external components, but it still means the same thing. You don't control it. 9 almost always means data hits a disk. It's somewhere where you store it temporarily, or somewhere where it can be cached, somewhere where an attacker can easily get it because it's no longer in transit. It's stored. And if it's stored there, whether it's in cache or whether it's on disk or something like that, then that's where the attacker, like if you and I were to go and pick someplace, I would hit a database before I try to hit the more complicated task of attacking data in flow. Much easier for me. It's static at that point.
Mm-hmm.
I can attack it. So that's my endpoint. So therefore, that's going to be the highest point in any diagram or any design where I'm going to hit. And then we work our way backwards from there. We say, okay, you've got the highest point, you've got the lowest point, which are the entry points. Then everything else is going to fit in between. Once you've done that, you've numerically ranked them. Then you apply some certain rules, and those rules are going to apply directly to Stride. And you're going to say, okay, outside to inside, spoofing. If it's lower to higher in terms of going along the zones of trust, it's now tampering, and it's also potentially elevation of privilege. Now, tampering, because I would rather tamper it when it's weaker and I can inject the command in as opposed to getting back the data, which is useful to me, but not as useful as injecting the command. Also, if I'm going to try to attack something, I'm going to try to attack it at a weaker point to bring my command in where I can elevate privilege into the higher point. Things, and then we go on from that to repudiation. That's an interesting one. Repudiation says, look, if you have a presence of both spoofing and tampering, you're going to probably have a situation of repudiation. Because how do I go about denying? Either I mess up some auditing, which is a tampering, and or I grab a hold of some context and I say, I'm so-and-so, I'm Tim. You're like, no, you're not. You don't have a beard. Go away. That kind of thing. And it's that kind of situation. So boom, okay, you got repudiation. Then information disclosure is from higher to lower because I'm going from a higher space to a less secure space, and therefore I'm potentially leaking information to something I shouldn't be. Denial of service, outside to inside, both the data and on the endpoint. Because if you don't lock down the endpoint, okay, you're asking for problems. And if you don't lock down the data, and this is the biggest problem, and you know this, Tim, is like, okay, a lot of times we said with denial of service, we're like, let the guys in networks take care of that crap. We don't want to deal with that low level stuff. Wrong. And I learned this the hard way. It's like, actually, we can do some of it by restricting the amount of data that comes into us, right? So if the amount of data that comes into us, if we restrict it to, I'm expecting a first name. I'm not going to ask for 3,000 characters, am I? That's kind of dumb, because I'm just basically asking for someone to say, oh, well, insert into or, select from or whatever case is. Like, okay, like I'm not going to. So I've got to restrict it down to what I want, and therefore a smart schema will tell me that thing right there. And therefore that denial of service is both on the data and on the input, on the endpoint. And then finally, elevation of privilege, which happens probably across the entire schema or the entire diagram, because at each point you want to make sure inside that you have a capability to stop a denial of privilege, an elevation of privilege situation from happening. Or, and this is where I think we fail as practitioners, and I'm also grossly, capable of that too, is that we think like, oh no, we'll stop them right here. And then you stop thinking about it and you're like, okay, well, hang on, there's 4 or 5 different functions that we call inside, and we just accept it. And you do? We can actually check that, can't we? We can actually check to make sure that that's a legitimate request coming in. And a lot of times we don't do that. And of course, it goes to our fault, because then we don't future-proof. And it's where threat modeling, obviously, basic threat modeling comes in. We don't future-proof our code. And I think threat modeling is very, very good about saying, future-proof your damn code or your system by doing this. So the idea behind the rapid threat model prototyping is we take the concepts, we say, we're going to take that idea of threat modeling, we're going to put a few statements around it, we're going to immediately link Stride to a number of different frameworks. That allows us then to say, we know what our threats are, and then from getting our threats, we can immediately find a number of different solutions. So if you're not a security practitioner, you like me, we would instantly rattle off 3 or 4 things. If you're just some poor sap who's an engineer, you can instantly get that linkage, and you can say, you know what? OWASP top 10 says elevation, or not elevation, or Stride says elevation of privilege, links to an OWASP top 10. What is the number one on OWASP top 10 is not elevation of privilege. It's not. The number one.
Remember that they change them every few years.
I know.
I'm thinking like injection, but I don't think
every 4 years they change. So injection, I'll give you a bit of history on that, which is interesting. Is that injection was the number one OWASP top 10 from 2003 when they started it until before the pandemic. Everything ends up before the pandemic, and At that point in time, they're like, you know what? Actually, it's no longer injection. And so for the longest time, it was injection attacks. And then they switched it over to elevation of privilege. And then it's not elevation of privilege because someone's going to, check me out on that.
Yeah.
And I can't remember it off my head. I'm not going to look it up. So I'm not a politician either. So, but it's so basically it's an elevation of privilege thing that you're saying that, look, privilege escalation, that to me is probably the most dangerous thing. I read a white paper that was dated 1967 that said privilege escalation is the most dangerous thing to computers this day. And funny enough, it's aged well. Because I think that's the situation now. And I don't care if you add all different things right there, it's still privilege escalation. And no matter the worst attacks we've seen have been privilege escalation attacks, just a more modern form of it, and more complex, but it's still been privilege escalation. So if you put that into the mind of your people who are working on it, you say, look, you're going to make that the most important thing, and you're going to have them look for it during the threat modeling session, and you're going to define it down by those 6 elements of STRIDE, it speeds things up tremendously.
Yeah, it's actually broken access control. I was like, maybe why don't I just look it up? But to your point, that's what it is, right? Essentially, broken access control is people being able to elevate to stuff that they, or get to stuff that they shouldn't have access to. So.
Exactly.
So how do you get started with this then?
Go to GitHub, look up rapid threat model prototyping, and I've got a ton of different information right there. If they're further interested, they can go to tutomantic.com. And they can get information there. But that's the commercial aspect right there. So if they're interested in just getting that, look up on GitHub. And then if anyone wants to contact me, jeff.hill@tutomantic.com, I'm more than happy to dig into RTMP and help them out. I went last year, I went to the first ThreatModCon over in Washington, D.C., and afterwards talked to a number of people who have been practicing my RTMP. It's like, wow, people are actually using this. A lot of people are actually using this. And I was more than happy to help them out. And actually went back and added to my model in addition, because there are a lot of interesting forks out there and people are providing some very, very useful things on top of that.
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest things that I get asked, because I'm speaking on threat modeling this year, and I've been speaking about it for years, talking about working with developers and AppSec stuff. And I was like, I just need to do a threat modeling talk. But that's the question I've been getting so far this year is like, how do you scale this? And I feel like this has the potential to help scale it, because I don't have a good answer. One, I haven't had to scale to like thousands of developers and teams. And usually it's like, usually it's like, if you have any good ideas, and I think this is a good idea. So I'd be curious to see how people, and if they are scaling it to bigger groups.
So I have scaled it successfully. But then I'm the person who's practicing it.
Right.
And in Nationwide, I got asked during the pandemic to join them as the threat model person. And originally, I thought I was going to organize something, and they said, no. You heard the guy doing all the threat models. I'm like, how many threat models? And he said 240. I'm like, no. It's not, no.
That's not going to work.
That's not going to work. I'm going to get overloaded. So I went back and I talked to the guy. I said, look, we've got to redress this. And I still had RTMP. I said, look, if we empower the teams to do this as part of their exercises when they do the user stories, and when they do sprint 0 at the higher level, we take the pressure off of us. He said, that's a pretty good idea. I said, taking the pressure off of us is a good thing. And then we go back and we touch base with them later on, and they control it. Ultimately, they should control their own destiny. They should control their own risk and their own security. So if we take it over, then we're controlling the risk and the security. And that's not the job of our function. Our function is to aid and abet them in providing better security. So we jump in and we say, look, guys, I'm going to sit in on your first few meetings, and I'm going to help you guys to go through the threat modeling bits, and then provide some advice and guidance on how to make it more efficient within your sprint. And then I'm going to back off. And sure enough, what's happened is they'll go in there, the security champion will drive the conversation, say, okay, 5 minutes is up. We're done with the threat modeling bit. We've provided these pieces of information. We'll put on the backlog and we'll move on. And they move on to functional stuff. And it works. Now, I'm not expecting them to come up with a final threat model. I didn't ask for that. I asked for them to come up with stuff they're concerned about. I come in afterwards. I can kind of talk to the security champion. I can say, what do you think we missed? He's like, like this, or she's like this. And then we kind of work out, okay, what do we want to pull off the backlog and put into the next sprint? And it becomes conversational. It's no longer confrontational. And then it works. You know what I mean? So therefore, they feel like they're getting some use out of it because it's giving them a better product. I'm feeling some use out of it because I'm getting some security built into it. And I'm telling the people up above, I'm like, look, we're not going to get 100%. If you want 100%, then give me a lot more time for the team, which you won't get. So we've got to work within the confines of what the team is allowed to do within that time. And we've got to be reasonable.
Yeah, and I think you can also see from the reduction in threats over time, right? Like you said, you're never going to have zero.
Beautiful story for you. When I was working at Visa, I came up to one of the guys and he said, what is this whole threat model malarkey? Like that. Like, all right, look, give me a chance to do it. And I talked to the team and I worked through when we did a threat model and then we set forward and we put tickets into. And originally I put in separate security tickets. I'm now not doing that anymore. I'm actually embedding them into the regular tickets because that didn't work. Okay. Because at one point it didn't work because the team leaders had just scratched the security ticket and said, no time, can't do that. Yeah, so
if it's in the ticket, they still got to work it. That's a great idea.
Yeah, exactly. So now what I do is I do what I call guerrilla threat modeling. I just embed it into the regular ticket.
That's a great idea.
You gotta, it's like, look, it's part of the acceptance criteria. You gotta do it, and it works though because the team understands to do it. The team, team lead goes, all right, we'll do it, and I'm like, God. What he said was he came afterwards and he said, this is amazing. I've never had this happen beforehand. Generally, we get 2 or 3 criticals, a couple highs, and a couple mediums and lows, right? He said, this time we did it. We got 0 criticals, 0 highs, a few mediums, and a few lows. He's like, that's amazing. How did you do it? Like, well, you did it. You allowed me to put the threat modeling in. And we basically sat down and you allowed the team to figure out what the hell the problem was going to be before they actually started working on it. I did. It's like, yeah, you gave the team the ability to do that. I didn't do anything. The team did all the work.
Yep.
Because ultimately we can't, you and I can't take that. It's like, we're just the enablers.
Yeah.
And the team says, here's how I say it to people is I say, look, you and I are we're the subject matter experts in security. We know nothing about the product. The subject matter experts of the product are the ones we talk to. Let them deal with it. Let them take care of it, and we'll nudge them like sheepdogs, bite them in the ankles a little bit, and get them going on this way. We'll get them. We'll get them on the right path. And aside from that, I was like, all right, look, I don't want to put my fingers too much on the scale. You guys figure it out. When you guys have a question, you turn to me, and I'll put in my 2 cents.
Yeah, and that makes them better at their job too. So, and
everyone wins, right?
Yep. Yeah, exactly.
And then eventually you can start pulling further and further away because they feel more confident, and then they'll only come to you and like, you know what? Hey, Geoff, we really don't. We know this might be an issue. We don't know what it is, but it's a weird pattern that we've seen. Can you help us out? Yeah, sure, I can help you out. Now all of a sudden you're freed up to do more, to cover more landscape, and it all works, and it's done organically.
Cool.
So that's and it's all done because they're using these open source frameworks, which they've made a link to. They don't have to talk to you anymore about it. And some teams actually I've worked with have said, okay, look, we're going to actually link to our own frameworks. We're going to link Stride to our own internal framework. Go for it.
Perfect. Yep.
You and I will do it. We'll work it together. Now you've got a perfectly, but Stride is a language. It still is a language, and it's got 6 elements. Hey, man, I can remember 6 elements. And it helps them to kind of revolve through it. And then the zones of trust. Any functional person can tell me if they look at a diagram, what's most important, what's least important to them, given a simple set of rules. If it's outside, if it's data hits a disk, okay, everything sits in between. There's a process business rules. It's a 5, a 4 or 5. Is it just a pass through? It's a 2 or 3. That kind of thing. Does it ask? Is it an entry point? It's a 1. Once you do that and you get that and you put that kind of function around it, then it's easy for the team to go through and to figure everything in the design where it all sits, and then they just apply Stride to it, And then from Stride, they get the linking to their mitigations.
Perfect. Is there, you've mentioned a couple different things. We'll have those on the show notes. Is there anything else you want to plug?
Yeah, I guess I will plug ThreatModCon for people who are fascinated and interested about that. There is one coming up in Portugal. I'm not going to it, but there is one coming up, and they do have several of them coming up. And like I said, I was at the first one last year in DC. It's a great thing, and I think you should do it. I think, and I think also people should be concerned and should be aware of secure by design initiatives that are happening across the US, Canada, the UK, and Europe. The reason is because right now the government agencies are being told to do this, and it's not long afterwards, as they say, when the camel's nose is in a tent, it's not long afterwards the rest of the camel comes in, because anybody who deals with the camel is going to have to deal with that. So secure by design, one of the easiest ways to deal with secure by design organically is to do threat modeling, because it's very functional, it's conversational, and therefore you can kind of, I guess, tick that box. And I hate using that term, but for a better use of a better word,
you're going to have to do it. Yeah, it's still got to get done.
And get it into the teams. And then the teams are able to be functional on their own as opposed to dysfunctional.
Gotcha. Yep. All right, cool. Well, Geoff, thanks for the great conversation, and thank you for joining me to discuss rapid threat modeling prototyping.
Thank you very much, Tim. Thanks for the time. It's been fantastic. And I'm looking over your shoulder at that boat, and I'm saying, we on that boat sailing off somewhere.
And that will do it. Hopefully you learned something. If you didn't, email me at timothy.dblock@exploresec.com or reach out to me on LinkedIn and let me know what you didn't learn, and we'll cover it in a future podcast. We'll see you next time, Security Explorers.